Well, on the 21st of January this year, 91 civilians were killed and more than 200 others hurt in one of the deadliest attacks seen on Yemeni soil in years. The Arab nation's been ravaged by a civil war since 2014, but did you know that the conflict has some South African connection? Well, last year, NGOs, Open Secret and the Southern African Litigation Centre won their first case in a major court battle to identify and block South African arms dealers from selling weapons allegedly used by rebels against civilians in Yemen. Now we hear that the High Court in Pretoria wants the overall review of this revelation sped up. To explain to us what this all means, we've got Open Secret's Michael Marchant live on the line now. Michael, thanks so much for joining us. We have discussed this before, and I thought that there was movement, having won the first round of initial litigation. Just take us up to speed, or bring us up to speed on where we are now.
Morning, Annika. So we had also hoped that there'd been some movement. And so, as you say, in June of last year, we were successful with the first part of the court order. And the court said to the National Conventional Arms Control Committee, you must serve all the permit holders, all the companies holding permits to export to Saudi Arabia or the UAE with the case to allow them an opportunity to join that case. And we hoped then that we could move quickly. Unfortunately, what has happened is that the NCACC has delayed us. They've been obstructive at every turn, and we're now sitting around about 7 or 8 months later, and the NCACC is still unable to show that all of those companies have indeed been served, which obviously stops us from being able to move forward. And in the second instance, they also still haven't, to our knowledge, certainly we haven't seen it, filed a full and proper record with all the documents show the decision-making process to grant the permits. And until they do those two things, we're stuck and can't move forward. That's why we're so happy with the intervention of the judge, Judge Bam, in January of this year. That judge has now been appointed to manage this case, and she has issued a very clear directive to the NCACC to comply with these orders within tight timeframes so that the case can move forward and the court can actually hear the merits and deal with the issue.
Michael, for those who haven't been following, can you give us a brief summary, please, of exactly what South Africa's involvement is and how it's ended up being possibly, and I'm wondering if you can maybe answer this, party to a war crime?
So this is something that Open Secrets investigated and published a report titled Profiting from Misery in 2020. And what we did is we looked at South African weapons exports from South African arms companies in this period from 2014 when the war started. And what we see is we see a big spike in exports to Saudi Arabia and the UAE just at the time that their intervention in Yemen is accelerating. And so in some of those years, we're talking about 40 to 50% of every weapon that left South Africa was going to one of these two states while they were engaged in the war in Yemen. Linked to this is, as you say, there is extensive evidence that has been before the world and before the South African government that these two states committed acts that may amount to war crimes or crimes against humanity in Yemen. This involves targeting civilians, targeting infrastructure that then harms civilians, using starvation as a method of war. This has been reported on consistently since the war began. And the South African government know about this. And we know that because they have expressed concern in international forums like the UN about what's happening there. And so South African law is very clear that the government and the NCACC has to consider these kinds of risks when deciding whether to approve weapons exports. And our argument to the court is that in this instance, they have failed to do that. And they've failed to account for what is happening in Yemen and the very grave consequences for civilians in that country.
What are the consequences for not just an individual exporting arms, but a country, should this come before a war crimes tribunal?
So this is a very tricky area, and one of the things that we've had to grapple with here is that in the South African case, there's no evidence that we have that the companies have been exporting without permits. And so we are in the situation where South Africa as a state may have to answer for the fact that it has been approving permits despite knowing what was happening in Yemen. And if those crimes ever do come before an international court, South Africa, and to be very clear, a range of other countries that supply these states with weapons, the United Kingdom, the United States, France, are large suppliers as well. It has been found, may be liable and would have to answer to those things. The more interesting question, I think, in this case is that in South Africa, the arms companies have been exporting in terms of permits, but does getting a permit erode their other responsibilities in terms of avoiding exporting to such regions? That is a matter, I think, that needs to be looked into. To be clear, it's not going to be the subject of this litigation. This case is very narrowly about the issue of the permits. But I think you raise an important point, which is there's often impunity in the international arms trade. And if the crimes in Yemen ever do come before a legal forum, the companies and the countries that supplied the war, despite knowing what was happening there, will have some very difficult questions to answer.
Well, thank you so much for keeping on this as litigants. Thank you. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't even know about it. So we owe that to you. Thank you so much, Michael Marchand from Open Secrets. Thank you for your time.